As housing prices skyrocket in major urban cities and supply continues to exceed demand, Ottawa being a prime example, fewer Canadians can afford even that first step in the housing market. And for those on the margins of our society, the availability of basic shelter has become an even greater challenge. Without shelter, the chances of those people becoming fully integrated, contributing members of our society becomes impossible. Romy Bowers and her team of experts have an exciting and ambitious goal. By 2030, everyone in Canada will have a home that they can afford and that meets their needs. She believes CMHC can be a catalyst for solving housing affordability challenges and be a leader in building an equitable housing system free of systemic racism. On behalf of GGFL, I'm thrilled to introduce you to Romy Bowers.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, and it's just it's so fantastic to be here. I think I was just talking to the people at my table. This is actually my first in-person event since I became CEO. I've done a lot of Zoom meetings, but I've actually not spoken publicly in an environment like this. So it's great to be back, and I hope this is the first of many events like this, because I really think Canadians need to get back to normal, and I really hope that this is going to be sort of the reopening of the economy. So thank you for having me here. And I really think, as Margot mentioned, I was a banker before I came to CMHC. I really enjoyed my career in banking, and I just love the dynamism of the banking industry. I'm so grateful for the experiences that I had there. And I was in a very interesting job. I was actually in the Treasury Department of the Bank of Montreal during the 2008 financial crisis. So I saw firsthand what happens to the banking system when there's an economic shock. And when you have a crisis like that, you learn so much. So it was a really pivotal time in my career. And I also learned what CMHC did well. It was a time when the economy was very, very uncertain. The government took very quick action to make sure that credit was flowing throughout the economy. And I saw the value of sound risk management, very quick, targeted response by the government in providing stability to the financial system. So it was really a great experience for me. I worked at Bank of Montreal for about 12 years, and I was actually working in Chicago at the time when I was approached to be the Chief Risk Officer at CMHC. And I had no intention of ever actually joining a Crown Corporation, but in retrospect, I think it was one of the best career decisions I've made. And I say that because CMHC is a Crown Corporation, and we have a commercial business. So I'm actually engaged in the market and working. Financial institutions and commercial developers are very important clients to CMHC. So it's really great to have that experience. But at the same time, I get to lead a group of very talented people who develop policy advice on housing for the government. So it's great to have that opportunity to have an impact on Canadian society, and so it's been a fantastic experience so far. And I think I became the CEO at a time that is interesting and very challenging. As I don't have to tell you people here how what a big issue housing is in Canada, and how affordable housing is so elusive for so many Canadians. And I think we saw that in the last federal election, what a hot button topic housing was. Regardless of your political affiliation, housing is so critical. And it's really an honor for me to lead this organization during this time. And my wish is that through the influence of government and the role that we play working with the for-profit and nonprofit sectors, we can do something very positive in the housing sector. And this is the reason I come to you here, because I know there's very many influential people around this room. And it's my belief that the housing crisis in Canada can only be solved when the public sector and private sector work collaboratively together. So I hope you share that sentiment, and I look forward to talking to you about that a little bit further. You may have heard about the National Housing Strategy. So right now, CMHC is responsible for a $72 billion investment that the federal government is making in affordable housing. And that's something that we're about 3 years into that strategy, and CMHC is responsible for that investment. And the National Housing Strategy, we provide financing for housing all across the housing continuum, but as government should, we focus on housing for the most vulnerable in our society. And when I think about what we've done in Ottawa, there's actually been a number of really great developments that we've actually funded in Ottawa, and I'll just give a few examples. I don't know if you've heard about the recent development in the Le Breton Flats. I understand that that's been vacant for quite some time, but I think there's some movement afoot to develop that. So recently we concluded an agreement with a company named Dream to build it's really actually going to be a complex of housing, providing deeply affordable housing, but also housing for the middle class as well. And it's going to be integrated in with commercial space and retail space as well. So very excited that CMHC can be a partner there. But CMHC also partners with smaller developments in Ottawa as well. So I can't list them all, but one good example is that in the CFB Rockcliffe lands, we worked with a nonprofit called the Multi-Faith Housing Initiative to develop a home for veterans who are actually homeless or are at the risk of experiencing homelessness. And one of the things I really love about my job is I actually get to talk to people who benefit from our investments in housing. So I had the opportunity to talk to a person named Bill Beaton, who really talked about the importance of, because he had experienced homelessness, having a place where he could call home, and just how grateful he was for the Government of Canada for investing in this kind of housing infrastructure. And again, these are a few examples, but it gives you a sense of the type of investments that CMHC has been happy to participate with nonprofits, but also for-profit developers in the Ottawa area. I think Margot mentioned our aspiration. By 2030, and we picked 2030 because that's aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we want everyone in Canada to have an affordable home that meets their needs. And it's a goal that really motivates all our employees. It really gives us a sense of purpose when we come into work. And I have to be honest with you, that goal of having affordable housing for everyone in Canada seems even more elusive now than ever before. And I think Canada's housing market on the market side has been robust for many, many years, but we've begun to see some of the cracks in the system. And during the pandemic, I think many people have realized that all is not well with the housing market. And despite many years of declining interest rates, people are paying much more for their housing, and there's a great mismatch between increases in income and increases in house prices, and that's a big problem for Canada. And from my perspective, there are two housing crises in Canada. And one, it affects middle-class households who are having more and more difficulty finding a place to buy and also rent in the regular market. And then there's also another crisis affecting the most vulnerable in our society. And because the housing markets are connected, when the regular market is so heated and there's so much competition, people who have less means also have a lot of difficulty finding housing, and I think that should be a concern for all Canadians. The market-related housing crisis has been developing for a couple of decades, but it was viewed by Canadians as a problem in Toronto and Vancouver. And what has changed during the pandemic is that this house price escalation crisis has spread to cities like Ottawa. And I think I probably don't need to tell you this, but you probably have seen incredible house price escalation in Ottawa. And I have, I should acknowledge, we have our chief economist, Bob Dugan, in the room today, so he can answer all the difficult questions. But Bob tells me that when you look at the Ottawa housing market, last 20 years, house prices go up about 6% a year, and that's been the norm. In the last 20 years, or last 2 years, it's gone up 20% per year. So if you look at house prices now, on average, they're 46% greater than they were prior to the pandemic. And that's a pretty shocking statistics, because I'm sure no one's incomes have gone up at that rate, especially during a pandemic. So you may ask, why is this the case? So what has happened in Ottawa? And there's, of course, there's not just one factor. So I just, comes from Bob's group, so I don't know, it's not coming from me, but coming from the experts, but there's a couple of factors. So you can imagine there was a huge pent-up demand. People couldn't buy houses during the crisis, so there's a sort of pent-up demand in the market. So that's one factor. We've had low interest rates for a long time, and it became even lower during the pandemic because the Bank of Canada stepped in to provide support to the economy as a whole with lower interest rates, and that's helped escalate prices further. Because of the pandemic, people are looking for homes with more space, and I think that's contributed to the escalation as well. And Ottawa is quite unique because the economy is pretty resilient. You have an amazing IT sector, there's a big public sector presence, and that's supported house prices as well. But the last reason, I think, is probably the most important one from our perspective. We feel that there is a great mismatch between supply and demand. And that's really at the root of many of the problems. And we're not talking just about market supply, but supply all across the housing spectrum. And that's an area that CMHC feels that we can contribute through our financing and through our other tools. And I always want to talk about renters. I know we tend to talk a lot about homeowners, but I want to talk about renters as well. Right now, the vacancy rate for rentals in Canada, in Ottawa, is 3.5%. So you think, well, that's pretty good. Like that's a pretty healthy vacancy rate. But when you actually look at rentals that are available for lower income members for a community, people who work in service industries, the vacancy rate is actually close to zero. So it's actually almost impossible to find a two-bedroom apartment to rent in the Ottawa area for less than $1,200, and that's a serious problem for our economy. And so I always ask myself, why should we care about this? Why should you in this room care about this? Because housing affordability is actually a big business issue. And I feel that this escalation in house prices and escalating house price costs is actually very bad for business, and it affects you as business owners. And it means that your clients, if they have such high housing costs, they have less money to spend buying your goods and services. In addition to that, Canadians have taken on a lot of debt to buy houses. And I don't know if you saw the stats in the Globe and Mail this weekend, but for every dollar Canadians earn, they have 1.86 cents in debt. So as interest rates rise, there's even less money for people to spend on other goods and services, and that's a problem. And when I think about your employees and the economy of the city, I think we need to think about these housing issues very seriously because there are these trickle-down impacts. I do think another interesting phenomenon that's happened during the pandemic is the migration away from large cities. So I live actually in Toronto, and I go down to downtown Toronto, and it's still a ghost town, unfortunately. And on one hand, it's great that people have the flexibility to move away from downtowns and high-priced market. And I know smaller towns and places like Gatineau across the river have really benefited. But I think this change in work habits has a big impact on business as well. And I think that's something that I don't know what the outcome of all that is going to be, but I'm sure as business owners, you probably wonder about what the long-term change in workplace behavior will be going forward. And Ottawa is a bit of a special case in this because Ottawa, more than any other city in Canada, the employees here have the ability to work remotely. About 50% of the people who work in Ottawa have jobs where it's possible to work remotely. So you wonder how that's going to actually translate to not only real estate practices, but how people use business services, especially in the downtown area. I feel that, again, I need to talk about the impact of all this on people in lower income brackets and the rental situation. And I always like to point out that even though we're such a rich country, 13% of Canadians are in what we call core housing need, where they spend 30% of their income on housing. And we also need to think about, I think on every single night that there's over 30,000 people who are homeless. And a lack of housing affordability impacts these populations as well. So anyhow, so that's a quick overview of the housing challenge. I know it sounds a little bit depressing, but I always like to now turn to what can we do about it? Because I think there is a lot that Canadians can do. Because I was listening to a testimony that the Bank of Canada governor gave to the, I think, the Finance Committee of the House recently. And one of the things that that really struck home with me is that the Bank of Canada recently did a survey of Canadians. And what really came through the survey was that Canadians care about themselves and the state of their own household finances, but they care about the household finances of others as well. And I think the sense of the collective vision of what's good for Canada is a really important thing to keep in mind as we think about housing affordability. And again, I want to go back to what we think is one of the biggest issues facing Canadians is this mismatch between housing demand and housing supply. And you've probably also read in the newspaper that Canada has one of the fastest growing populations in the G7. And this is a really great thing, because many countries in the G7, their populations are actually declining. But because we have such a progressive immigration policy, our population is actually growing. But we're not building enough houses to welcome these new Canadians, newcomers into our country, and that's something that we need to address ASAP. And with this whole supply-demand imbalance situation, you think, well, gosh, the answer is simple. We just need to build more houses. We have so much land in Canada. What's the issue? And again, it's easy for me to say this, but I know the fix is a little bit more difficult than it seems. Through the National Housing Strategy that I mentioned, the federal government is investing $72 billion over 10 years, and we're going to create 180,000 new housing units, which sounds great, but it's not nearly enough to address the housing needs that exist in Canada. And that's why we need more support from the private sector, because when you look at housing stock in Canada, 95% is provided by private sector financing and private sector. So government needs to work together with the private sector to make sure that the supply response is robust. And maybe there's a lot of barriers to that supply response, but maybe if I could point out two of them. One of them is often happens at the municipal level. And again, this is not to point the finger at the municipal level, but it's very difficult sometimes to create new housing, especially in well-developed neighborhoods. And part of it, there's a certain amount of red tape and maybe inefficient processes in certain municipalities that's causing part of the problem. But another part of the problem is NIMBYism, and especially homeowners. There's a tendency to want to protect their neighborhoods and resist new developments. And there's always, in my mind, a balance between taking into consideration the needs of homeowners, but also taking into consideration the people who want to move into the neighborhood. And when you think about things like climate change, creating more density, providing housing for people who are in the lower income brackets, we really need to have a better balance between those two opposing forces. And I hope that as we have these sort of national conversations, we'll have better clarity. And this has to happen at the local level, because a lot of the housing decisions happen there. A couple of weeks ago, we hosted a housing supply summit, which was attended by the Prime Minister, Minister Hussein, who is Minister of Housing, was also a key driver of the summit. We had municipal leaders from all across the country, and it was really a great opportunity to talk about what can we do all together to create more housing in Canada. And it was really a fantastic event. And you may have heard that as part of the election promise of the current Liberal government is to create a municipal accelerator fund. And this is a recognition that the federal government needs to provide financial support at the municipal level to block those barriers for development. So again, I don't have a crystal ball, but I anticipate that in the coming budget, there will be more investments by the federal government at the municipal level to make housing supply more of a reality. And recently I read Mark Carney's book called Values, and one of the things that I really liked about his book was that he talked about how the government plays an important role in creating the foundational tools for economic growth. But it's really the power of the private sector that actually provides the financing, the operational capacity to make things happen. And I think that's the model that we really espouse at CMHC. And I talked to many different audiences, but because I have connections in the financial services industry from my past life, I've had some recent success, or my teams have, getting the Bank of Montreal, Scotiabank, and Van City Community Bank to make a $22 billion commitment over the next 10 years in affordable housing. And I just use that as an illustration of the interest that exists in the private sector, of the importance of housing and the need for the private sector to get involved as well. And we also at CMHC work with smaller actors as well, because I know $22 billion sounds like a lot of money, but we've also had really great partnerships with smaller firms. We worked with a tech company called HelpSeeker, and they actually have an app that helps link social housing and also supports with people who are more vulnerable in our society. So that's a really good example of technology enabling connections between housing resources and the people who need them most. We've also seen a lot of innovation in things like modular housing and also things like green bonds, green financing. So that's been great as well. So that CMHC is very happy to support. I also think with all the focus on climate change, green housing and the transformation of the construction sector is it's a business opportunity, but it's also an opportunity to contribute to a more robust housing stock in Canada. So again, another area where CMHC is really looking forward to contributing. The third area where I think there's a lot of opportunity for partnerships between the government and business is retrofits of rental apartment buildings. When you look at the rental apartment stock in Canada, most of them were built in the 60s and 70s, aging very rapidly, in need of massive renovation. And it's very tricky to do this because of the cost, but also you don't want to impact the residents living there. And I feel that there's an area where there is room for a lot of innovation and participation by the private sector in making these renovations happen. Because unless we do that, we're never going to be able to meet our climate change commitments. And that's really a key focus for CMHC and for the government as well. So I just want to close off by just really encouraging you to be interested in housing, to if there's projects that you're interested in, and if you feel that CMHC could provide support, please reach out to me, because I'm very happy to engage. We have 2,500 very talented people who are very anxious to work with you to make housing situation better for all Canadians. And really, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to such an influential audience today. Housing is local, but I think in this room, there's a lot of potential for making housing outcomes so much better for people living in Ottawa. And ultimately, I think that's great for business, and it's great for the economy of the Ottawa area. So with that, I wanted to thank you.